So elsewhere, I called Born in Blood and Fire the main textbook for our course. I showed you what the contents of Wood and Alexander include. So that's, again, more specific, focused pieces of writing from historians, primary source excerpts from people who lived through the time periods we're studying, so that we can get little snippets of more kind of precise and detailed information about the history. Chasteen's doing kind of the other end of the spectrum with this book. He's giving us an overarching narrative that will help us understand what's the big story here. How do these other snippets of information, how do they fit into a larger story? That's what he's doing. That's kind of what we read about in Unit 1 when we read his introduction, first chapter, Welcome to Latin America. So our discussions there when we were trying to define Latin America, compared it to the Calle 13 song, Latino America, that's what he's kind of signaled to us in this introduction. So I'm going to go back to the table of contents here. And again, remember, if you don't have the fourth edition of this book, that's the one I'm showing you, the most current one, that is totally okay. You can compare this table of contents to the edition that you have, and I think you'll find that they line up pretty well. In some editions, the first chapter is not numbered, so Encounter is number 1, so it just kind of shifts all the numbering a little bit. But when you look at the reading schedule, so for Unit 2, I've assigned you to read Chasteen 2 through 4, especially 3 and 4. So again, we're looking at Encounter, Colonial Crucible, and Independence. It's that same kind of thematic issues that we talked about earlier in the video about the Problems book by Wood and Alexander. So, again, look at the table of contents, get a sense of what is the big picture here. I told you to focus more specifically on 3 and 4. The Encounter, it's not unimportant, but the idea of what kinds of institutions came about during the colonial period, that's going to be covered in Chapter 3. And that's more germane to the guiding question for the unit. So that's why I made that indication. So I'm going to skip ahead to Chapter 3, page 55. Whoops. And kind of show you what some of the features in this book are and how I would approach reading it. I had it folded over and I forgot, so I could have found it more easily than that. So here we are, Colonial Crucible, Chapter 3. You'll notice that there's an image that represents the chapter at the beginning of each of these. There's a timeline, so note what the main kind of few major events that he points to here. And of course, there could be many, many more. This is a span of almost 200 years, from 1600 to the 1790s. And so what are the things that he is identifying as most significant? Why? You might not be able to answer that question of why yet, but you can keep these things in mind as you go through the chapter. As was the case with the Wood and Alexander book, I'm going to try to read the introduction that he has here. He doesn't designate it an introduction, but usually he has either a vignette about a specific story from the time period or theme that he's looking at, or just kind of an overall overview of that era. So in these just 2 paragraphs on 55 and 56, then Chasteen introduces what colonial Latin America was like. I'm going to stop reading word for word at that point, and now I'm going to look at headings and images. So here's an image of the mines at Potosí. He's talking about economics. Of course, mining was a big part of that. Sugar mill in Brazil. From that image, I can tell that enslaved people were working that sugar mill. Map of colonization. Next, I'm going to look at this power called hegemony, and I'm going to say, okay, I probably need to figure out what that means. So I'm going to keep going. Here's a picture, another image. I do notice as I'm just skimming through here, he's talking about the place of women in colonial society in this section called hegemony. And then he's talking about a process called transculturation. So at the very least, I know that when I come out of this chapter, I want to know what hegemony means, at least as far as what he has said, and what is transculturation, whether or not I read all of this word for word. I'm going through thinking about these images, and then I'm looking at the fringes of colonization. So what might that mean? the borders, the edges of the colonial world. Why would he want to talk about that as opposed to the centers of colonization? What does that mean? Why does that matter? So again, just using those headings to think about what he might be presenting here. And then late colonial transformations. I know that's getting toward the end of this chapter because it's going to round out the colonial era. So this is kind of what are the administrative changes. There's this cast painting of how the social and racial hierarchy worked. And then I realize, he's ending here. The Wars of Independence would change that. What would they change? And since I've looked at the table of contents, I know the next chapter that I'm going to read is about independence, so I know what's coming. Next, in this book, I can look here to see these key terms and vocabulary. So from my just quick overview of this, did I notice these things? If I didn't, maybe I should go back and see. You don't have to answer the study questions, but if they help you think about what is this major story of the colonial era, especially relative to our guiding question, then they might be helpful. But again, you don't have to specifically write or do anything with them. And then lastly, there's always a countercurrents section in these chapters where there's kind of maybe a counterpoint or just giving a little more specific information about something that was referenced briefly in the chapter. So this one's about colonial rebellions. And so you can read all the titles of what they were. As a historian of New Mexico as well, I realized that the Pueblo revolts isn't specifically listed here. I guess it is right here, 1680, under just general indigenous revolts. So maybe I'm wondering, why aren't we talking about those in more specific terms? So what I'm trying to show you here then is this idea of being curious to help you go through the readings. Once I've read that, I've decided, I kind of have an idea of those the bigger shape of what the colonial era was like because of the skimming that I did. And let me actually go back to this one. So transculturation, I decided I wanted to define what transculturation is. So I read this first paragraph, and that gives me a sense that this was an idea that came from an anthropologist named Fernando Ortiz. And then I decide I'm going to read the topic sentences of the rest of the section so that I can just get a sense of how he came to his definition of what transculturation is. If there's something that I don't quite understand, I'll read a little bit further in the paragraph. But once I kind of have a general idea, I'll just move on. I'll use these images to help me have some context. And then I decided I don't really even know what's going on with the fringes of colonization, so I'm going to read that section more or less word for word. But that's the only one. I'm going to read word for word in this chapter. Once I've gotten the hang of that and I understand who Zumbi is and why he's talking about the edges of the colonial world relative to the center. And again, you don't have to have these same questions that I have. I'm giving you examples of things you might think about, things that cross your mind. So the name of the game here is really be curious as you read, ask questions. Then I'll do the same thing with the independence chapter. So again, spend as much time as you need to get a sense. You may want to read Chasteen first because it gives you that big picture story before you go to Wood and Alexander. But also, they have their introductory sections in each chapter that give you some context too. So you can kind of figure out what works best for you in terms of understanding. Don't hesitate to ask questions. There is a forum on the discussion board where you can ask questions. You can ask questions on Twitter or in the reading responses section on the discussion board. If something just didn't really make sense to you, that you can pose questions as part of your response to the reading. All right, so I hope this is a helpful walkthrough of how you might approach reading our course texts. Do use the podcast as well for an additional perspective. That's something you can listen to while you're doing other things. You don't have to actively sit down and read for that part of the assigned materials. And then if you're interested, there's always optional reading as well. If you're interested and have time, or if you just want to see what this one's about, put that article aside for later when you might have more time to come to it, that's also great. Again, hopefully what I'm trying to emphasize here is that this is a learning experience that you can undertake and that you can allow your own curiosities and interests to shape within the context of that big, broad guiding question for the unit. As with everything else in our class, please don't hesitate to ask questions whenever you have them, and I look forward to working through the history of Latin America with you this semester.